Former Reform MP Rupert Lowe says Nigel Farage is a coward and a viper, but the public seem to think he could be the next Prime Minister.
As well as analysing the row, we're going to be speaking to the father of the House, Sir Edward Lee, about the Tories' chances of taking on reform, and some exclusive polling to the Telegraph that reveals that the party can completely obliterate Labour at the next general election.
Well, Camilla, we were calmly preparing this podcast to talk about our exclusive poll in the Daily Telegraph, which shows that if the local election results were repeated in a national election, Labour would lose a huge number of seats to Reform. The Conservatives would lose a huge number of seats to Reform. Momentum is building under Nigel Farage when, bang, this statement drops from Rupert Lowe, and it changed the whole conversation for today about Nigel Farage.
So basically what happened initially was that the MP for Great Yarmouth was told by the Crown Prosecution Service that charges would not be brought against him in relation to the accusation that has been made by the party chairman, Zia Yusuf, that he used threatening language towards him. So he finds out that he's not going to have to go to court. He had been questioned by police. But to quote the CPS, we have decided that our legal test for criminal prosecution has not been met. Clearly, he's had some warning, because as that announcement is made by the CPS, he then releases this blistering statement. And my goodness me, Kamal, I mean, we read it earlier and we were like, wow, he's not holding back at all.
Let's go through some of it.
It's quite the salvo. So he's talking about how these claims against him went beyond political infighting. He describes them as a sinister attempt to weaponise the criminal justice system against me. He talks about the fact that he thinks it's as a result of constructive criticisms of Nigel Farage. You'll remember that the row initially kind of broke open because Rupert Lowe gave an interview to the Mail on Sunday where he suggested he was to the right of Farage and that Farage was going slightly soft when it came to deportations of illegal migrants and all the rest of it. I am ashamed to have shared a parliamentary platform with them, he says, in relation to his former colleagues in Reform. Ashamed to have trusted them. Ashamed to have called them friends. Farage is no leader. He's a coward and a viper. I feel deeply embarrassed that I have ever thought he was the man to lead.
And then he raises at the end of this, and we're going to go into detail with this with Edward Lee and with Tony Diver later on in the podcast, but there's a bit at the end which must cause some nervousness for Reform and Nigel Farage. There's the test of his character, and will the public hear it? And I want to ask you that, Camilla, in a second. But at the end, Rupert Lowe says, there will very soon be an alternative to the rotten leadership of Reform. And to those of you who have supported me during this incredibly difficult period, thank you. I've been touched by your messages of kindness. Without your support and without my social media platforms, I would have been buried by their smears. You'll be hearing a lot more from me very soon. So it's not just going to be blue on turquoise. There's going to be on the right of or possibly on the right in the UK, the Conservatives, Reform, and some form of Rupert Lowe-led party, which will be, as Rupert Lowe has been, much more aggressive on the issue of immigration, particularly in the United Kingdom.
Yes, one wonders whether he's contemplating joining forces with Ben Habib, also disenfranchised from Reform. He's also been, Habib, very critical of Nigel Farage and this notion that he has a kind of messiah complex, can't delegate, and wants to be the main man at all times.
We'll put in our interview with Ben Habib in the show notes. Do go back to that, because he says in that, didn't he, Camilla, that they were looking at starting a new party, what you might say on the spectrum to the right of Reform.
Also, listen to this, he says. For the good of the country, Nigel Farage must never be Prime Minister. And there will be some in Camp Reform who actually think Lowe is being really disloyal, who'll be turning around and saying, I'm sorry, you wouldn't even exist as an MP if it wasn't for Nigel Farage. This friendly fire, if you can call it that, I mean, it seems rather unfriendly, but this, kind of strange act of harry-carry is not helping anybody.
And to be clear, we both spoke to senior people in Reform when the first allegations, obviously not founded now, to reach the bar of any kind of charge against Rupert Lowe were made, that said that Rupert Lowe within the party was himself very disruptive. So there were some private WhatsApp messages that were leaked in which Nigel Farage described Rupert Lowe as disgusting and contemptible. He said he accused Nigel Farage of damaging the party just before elections. So it seems that there was no love lost, clearly, between the two men, and they were clearly having an internal battle within the party before these more serious allegations came to light.
Now, the question here is anyone going to be listening to Rupert Lowe on this? Yes, he's got a social media following. Yes, he is a character within that kind of right of the Tory movement. And he's actually quite popular. I mean, most people who meet Rupert Lowe say he's a very polite man. He's got this extensive business career behind him. He's a self-made millionaire. And people, I think, respect him. He didn't need to go into politics and has decided to do so because he's very patriotic. He believes passionately in bringing immigration down and other causes. He's put a hell of a lot of personal money behind this idea of a private grooming gang prosecution. So within the Westminster bubble and the Twitter sphere, so to speak, I think this kind of story does cut through. Whether it's going to have a wider impact on people generally wondering whether Nigel Farage is fit to be Prime Minister. I mean, people are already asking themselves that anyway. He's a complex figure, isn't he, Farage? Because we see him as this front man in the same vein as Boris Johnson. And sometimes when we look at people who are political showmen, we do question whether they're across the detail. And actually, Boris Johnson was quite good at delegating the detail. That's why he got Michael Gove in. That's why he got Dominic Cummings for his sins in and all the rest of it. There's this sense that Nigel Farage isn't good at delegating or sharing the limelight and that's problematic.
I think don't underestimate Rupert Lowe. I remember speaking to a cabinet minister in the Labour government about what they were most worried about reform. And they said three names: Nigel Farage, Zia Yusuf and Rupert Lowe, because Rupert Lowe knew how to run things. I think the danger for Nigel Farage, from what Rupert Lowe has said, is that he's picking up something, Rupert Lowe, that some people already believe, i.e. that he's not to be trusted to run anything bigger than his own ego. But the second point is, what Nigel Farage is trying to do is go from that 27%, 28% in the polls to the 32%. So it's the 4% who he doesn't have yet and above. And they, I think, will hear things like this because they haven't moved yet. And so he's got to convince them that he does have the character to possibly lead the country. And I think that's where the significance of this in the Westminster bubble, you're right, won't translate to most voters in the country. But there is a danger there that the 4% that he needs will notice.
Although the 4% that he needs will probably be to the left of the righties that are already supporting him. And therefore, Rupert Lowe does him a favour.
Five-dimensional chess.
I know, it's complicated. But Rupert Lowe, who is kind of the kind of person who would say, I think we need to deport people even if they've got British passports, and I think we should include Tommy Robinson in the conversations.
And people who don't speak English very well, for example.
Yes, so
what are they doing here?
Him appearing to be to the right of Nigel Farage in turn makes Nigel Farage look more moderate, which might be more appealing to some of the Conservatives that can't bring themselves at this stage to vote for reform, but might consider doing so in the future. So, yes, I agree, my head is about to explode on all this. But all of this could, in a way, play into Farage's hands if he plays it correctly. I tell you whose hands it does play into quite nicely. Although, can I just express my absolute frustration? How divided does the right need to be right now? We've got the Tories and Reform fighting over the same territory. Now we've got Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe fighting over the territory too. This is getting silly.
And I think in the end, maybe that does actually help Labour. And the big worry, obviously, for voters, whether it's for Conservatives, Reform, or if there is another party led by Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe, is that all this fighting on the right just simply gives Labour the opportunity to be the government for the next 2 decades.
And I think there's probably quite a cogent argument for saying that all of this turquoise infighting probably does the beleaguered Tories a favour. We're joined now by Sir Edward Lee, veteran Tory, if you don't mind me calling you that, Sir Edward, the longest-serving MP in Parliament and Father of the House. Remind us when you were first elected.
In June 1983, Mrs Thatcher's great landslide.
Get longer, wouldn't you, for murder? This is crazy. And it's a funny time, isn't it, to be a Conservative, I guess. We've had the general election drubbing. We've had the local election drubbing. You recently featured, I don't know if you saw this at the weekend, on a sort of list of potential defectors to reform alongside Jacob Rees-Mogg. Is that something you've considered as the Tories have counted their losses?
No, I'm not going to defect. I mean, some people might say I'm too old and idle to defect, and I certainly don't want the aggravation. And I certainly wouldn't want to be disloyal to all the many people who supported me locally in 11 general elections. So I'm not the defecting type. But I'm not sure I'd want to defect anyway, because the Conservative Party, for all its faults, it has many faults, has been part of our history for 200 years, and I'm perfectly happy to fight for it. But I'm in constant anguish and disagreement with it, I have to accept.
Over what issues, Sir Edward?
Well, we all know that we had that amazing majority under Boris, and we frittered it away. The thing I'm most angry about, and this is where my constituents who all voted Reform last week got a point, I'm most angry about the way we unleashed mass legal immigration in this country. After all, budgets come and go, but the way that we let in a sort of up to 1 million people each year was ridiculous. Now, we all know there were reasons for it. You mentioned Jacob. Jacob told me that when he was in the Cabinet subcommittee, the Health Secretary rushed in and said, we've got to let these people in, otherwise the NHS is going to collapse. And the Education Secretary said, we've got to let these people in, otherwise the university is going to collapse. And the Business Secretary rushed in and said, all the cafes and restaurants. But what the people are really angry about it, and I'm angry about it, and I'm really angry about the fact we were so weak and wet and hopeless about stopping the illegal boats. We should have just got out of the Court of Human Rights, we should have arrested them, detained them and sent them home, and it's dangerous, illegal, and is driving my constituents and my people crazy. So we made many faults, but I'm going to stick with the Conservative Party, and by the way, we're changing the party all the time, and I'm pretty confident that very soon we're going to commit to getting out of this ridiculous Court of Human Rights and arresting people, sending them back, and sort of mending this awful wound which is causing us so much damage.
Are you sure Kemi Badenoch's going to commit to that? Because when we had the leadership race, Robert Jenrick was crystal clear on it, and Badenoch's doing this thing of, we need to have many conversations behind the scenes and think about all this very carefully, and we're not going to be rushing out policy. I mean, she should know by now whether she wants to be in or out of it.
No, you're absolutely right. That's why I supported Robert Jenrick. This is like the arguments we had for years, whether the Conservative Party should be in the European Union or not. We've got to just lance this ball, we've got to commit to it. And I've had conversations with her only last week. It's pretty obvious to me that we're in an existential crisis and we're going to get out of it. Our only hope as a party is to occupy the same ground as Reform on immigration and net zero and these other issues that are driving people crazy. And she's got to commit to it very soon. This business of saying, I want endless policy reviews, we're in opposition. We're in the days of digital communications and podcasts, of the daily news round. You can't have endless reviews. So we've got to commit to it. If we don't do it, it's not just her who will be out, we'll all be out, and quite rightly so.
Does she listen to you when you say it this plainly?
Yes, she does listen. Actually, the thing with Kemi is quite good. If you're tough with her, if you give her a piece of your mind, she does respond. I'm absolutely confident, and I've talked to Chris Philp on many occasions about this. There is a very small number of MPs, Conservative MPs, a vanishingly small number, who are still committed to all this sort of human rights stuff. But even I was talking to some very senior MP, an MP who's in the Cabinet for many years, who is considered to be very much on the Liberal, or shall we say, wet side of the party. He said, we've just got to get out of the Court of Human Rights and arrest and detain these people and deport them.
So, Edward, we've been talking, Camilla and I, at the beginning of the podcast about this big development with Rupert Lowe and him coming out with some really sharp criticisms of Nigel Farage and the possibility of him ever being Prime Minister. If I could just read out one section to you on it.
This comes after he has been cleared. He was being questioned by the police for using threatening language and behaviour, and the Crown Prosecution Service have said today, we are not going to bring charges against him. There isn't enough evidence to back up these claims.
So this is from Rupert Lowe. If Farage were ever to control the vast power of the British state, I believe he would not hesitate to do to his adversaries what they have tried to do to me. With real power, I fear he would wield that immense responsibility to crush dissent, as he has done time and again over the years. You've raised the issues where, for voters, the Conservatives are incredibly weak. What do you think of Nigel Farage as a possible Prime Minister of the United Kingdom?
I think he's an amazingly effective politician, and he has this ability, which very few politicians have, to connect to people in the way that Boris did, and somebody like on the left, Tony Blair did, or on the centre, David Cameron did. So he's an extraordinarily effective politician. I think it's very unlikely he'll become Prime Minister, because I think that obviously if there was a by-election now, he'd probably win any by-election. And I think in our constituencies last week, people were viewing it as a parliamentary by-election. Our problem with the Conservative Party is that people haven't forgiven us for being in power for 14 years, but the Labour Party's cocked it up so badly that they're angry with everybody. So I don't think Farage is going to get 100 seats or 200 seats or become Prime Minister. And he does have a history of falling out with everybody who comes too close to him or threatens him. And so Rupert Lowe may well have a point. And by the way, I think Rupert is a very nice chap, so I'm very surprised he was treated in this very harsh and unpleasant manner. And it's not, for instance, that's not how we run the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party, for all its faults, is a democracy. You don't just kick people out on a whim. You have to go through a process. So, I mean, that's one of the other reasons why I would never defect and join Reform.
Will you reach out to Rupert Lowe? Do you think the Conservatives should, and see if you can bring him into your tent?
Well, why not? Let's bring in everybody. He seems to me to be a thoroughly good chap, a successful businessman, very personable, honourable. And these charges were obviously completely ridiculous. But I doubt if it would dent Nigel Farage's popularity in the short term, because this is sort of Westminster bubble stuff. People just watch Nigel Farage on television and he thinks he speaks their language. And we have to do the same. We have to reach out to people and talk in very simple terms, and so that people understand where we stand.
But doesn't what Rupert Lowe says say something to people who might be considering voting Reform about the character of the man? In a way, this surely must be helpful for Kemi Badenoch, the Conservatives, because as you say, we're a different type of party led by a different type of leader.
Farage is no leader. He is a coward and a viper. I feel deeply embarrassed that I ever thought he was the man to lead. I mean, that is damning from Lowe, isn't it?
I have to be quite honest. I've been in politics for 42 years as an MP, and I never, ever make personal attacks. So I'm not going to make a personal attack on Nigel Farage, Kemi Badenoch, Keir Starmer, or anybody else. But you've heard what a man who's worked with him has said, and there is obviously a character issue here. And I think the result of the general election is going to be very different from any by-election we have or any county council election we had, for the reasons you've outlined and what Rupert has said.
Having been an MP since 1983, I'm just intrigued. Who on either side of the ideological divide has been the most impressive parliamentarian you've ever worked alongside?
Well, you should know me. I was one of Mrs. Thatcher's boys. I was the very last minister she appointed. Geoffrey Howe left the government and I entered it. I worked with her 50 years ago. I walked into central office with her 50 years ago. I was on her staff. She was the most amazingly, obviously, unbelievably hard-working person, very clever, committed, but above all very kind to her staff. So, of course, my heroine is Mrs. Thatcher. And I have to say, all the Conservative leaders ever since have been a deep disappointment to me. But
amen to that. This is music to my ears.
Well, you're going to get huge agreement in the Daily Tea from that. Camilla and I are both big fans of Margaret Thatcher. Could I ask you, without the changes that you have outlined, our poll today suggests that you would indeed lose your seat to Reform if you continue on this same trajectory. If you don't change, do you think that more Conservative MPs are going to be washed away?
Yes, I think this is an existential crisis. Colleagues come up to me in the tea room and say, is this as bad as 97? It's far worse than 97. Admittedly, Tony Blair was a much better performer than Keir Starmer, but the referendum party quickly faded away. We now have a party to the right of us, which is hoovering up our people. This is an existential crisis for the Conservative Party. This is like the Corn Laws. We could have a Labour government for the next 20 years. And by the way, I think our only hope, sometime, not now because Farage thinks he's going to destroy us, but sometime the next 2 years before the general election, we're going to have to deal with reform, because otherwise it's ridiculous. We're just carving up the centre-right, right-wing vote, and we're letting in Labour forever. So we are in a deep crisis. We've got to do something about it.
Before the next general election, just to clarify
absolutely.
that.
But Kemi Badenoch has said that will never happen.
Oh, well, of course she says that.
Right.
I mean, Jenrick says that, but I mean, if you talk to these people, I'm not going to give away confidences, but I mean, I don't mind giving away confidences, one remove, but apparently one of my colleagues sidled up to Farage and said to him, are we going to do a deal a few months ago? And he just sort of said, of course, so it's going to be a deal. It's obvious.
But at the same time, people close to Nigel Farage were briefing even last night at a book launch I attended for Lord Ashcroft's book, Red Flag, which is about Keir Starmer. We don't need to do a deal with the Tories. We don't need the Tories. Look at how the local election results translate nationally. We could have a higher vote share than the other two major parties and just get a majority on our own.
It's all rubbish. I've lived through so many by-elections where completely rock-solid Tory seats and Labour seats have fallen to an opposition party, to a minor party. I assure you, we will not be wiped out of the general election. But if we carry on as we are, the most likely result is that we will not make any significant advance or even lose a few seats, only gain. Remember, we only gained 4 or 5 seats, was it, between 1997 and 2001? I've been through this. I've got great institutional memory. You can't panic me. The Conservative Party is not going to be destroyed. There's not going to be the Reform Party with an absolute majority. All that's going to happen is we're going to keep on taking bites out of each other when there's no need, because we agree on virtually everything, and then Keir Starmer will be back and we'll be sitting in this room in 5 years' time and he'll still be Prime Minister.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Tony Diver, the Associate Political Editor of The Telegraph, joins us in the studio. Interesting day for Reform and Nigel Farage, isn't it? On one hand, absolutely brutally, verbally assaulted by Rupert Lowe, and at the same time, you've worked with Electoral Calculus, the polling company, to reveal that Reform could knock a number of key Labourites and Tories out of their seats.
Well, that's right. It seems like we go through this every day with Reform. On the one hand, the headlines show the public is totally with them on the project that they're trying to sort of unveil to the country. On the other hand, there's all of this kind of sideshow stuff going on. And the Rupert Lowe story today is just another example of that, showing that actually, despite his conduct being reported to the Met and a file being passed to the CPS, something that Reform made sort of great hay out of when it happened, no further action is going to be taken, and the party's dominating the headlines once again for all the wrong reasons.
I mean, Rupert Lowe describing him as a viper, saying that he is not fit to ever be Prime Minister. Do you think, given the momentum that the poll that we've done today and you've written up today for us, shows that the public is on their side, do you think any of this stuff will get out of what's described as the Westminster bubble? Luke Trill, the director of More in Common, the polling company, said that he had been hearing from focus groups that some Reform curious voters, if we can describe them like that, are not moving to Reform because of the Nigel Farage issue, if we can put it like that.
Yeah, I think we see this pattern a lot with these kind of challenger opposition parties. We saw it with UKIP, we saw it with the Brexit Party, which is when we're away out from a general election and people are frustrated with the government and they're looking for an alternative, these parties do very well, and there's an element of protest vote to the whole thing. The challenge for Farage and the other Reform leadership is to convince people that they can be a party of government, that Nigel Farage genuinely could be Prime Minister. And I think we've seen a bit of a shift to talking about that in the last few weeks. Now, when they're interviewed, they say that Nigel Farage is going straight to number 10. The challenge for them is over the next couple of years, are they able to build a genuine sense of credibility among the public? Can they, for instance, put up a number of people who we could see being cabinet ministers? Could we see a whole team of Reform people at the top of government that we believe would be a coherent and credible political force? And they may well be able to do that. Previously, Farage's other projects have struggled to make that final step between having massive momentum in the polls and the support of large chunks of the public. and translating it into governing. And it seems that Reform has got the best chance of any of these projects to do that. It seems that they've got more infrastructure, more money. They're a much more serious political party. But that is what people in Reform will be sitting around at the moment and trying to do. And headlines about Rupert Lowe and being called a viper by a man who was sat next to these people on the Reform benches not too long ago doesn't really help.
I was at a couple of events last night. Nigel Farage was at them, along with Richard Tice and indeed Sarah Pochin, who's their new MP in Runcorn. And the rhetoric was sort of twofold. First of all, we don't need a pact with the Tories. We can govern on our own with a majority, which brings us on to this polling. And secondly, I made the point, well, my goodness, if you're predicted to have this many MPs, you have got to get recruiting fast to have serious and credible candidates fighting each constituency in the UK. To that, Farage looked a bit sort of exhausted, pretty tired.
After the councillors.
Well, he was campaigning so heavily in the locals. And you sort of look at him thinking, my goodness me, this is, quite the marathon ahead. So this is the best analysis we've so far got of the local elections and how they might translate nationally. What's the top line figure then? How many seats or what size of majority does electoral calculus predict at this stage Reform could win, Tony?
Well, perhaps I should just explain the kind of methodology
Yes.
of what this study has done, because obviously the day after the local elections we had all of these predictions as to what Reform quake across the country would look like and how many seats they would have. This is something slightly different, and the reason it's come a bit later is because it's much more difficult and it takes longer to do. What it does is it looks at all of the wards that voted in the local elections earlier this month, and it translates the specific votes of particular people into votes in a parliamentary vote. So what we've got here is only the constituencies where local elections were held on May the 1st. So that's about 22% of constituencies across the UK. But it actually allows you to say, well, if each specific person voted for the same party in a general election than they did in the local elections, this is what the result would be, which is quite different to saying, well, here's the uniform swing that we saw across the country in all of these votes, and let's just apply that in a blanket way to all 650 constituencies, which statistically is a lot less credible than actually looking at what people voted for on the day. So we have results from 145 constituencies, and they show that Labour would be pretty much wiped out by Reform. They would lose all but 3 of the seats that they hold in those 145 constituencies, and the vast majority of those would go to Reform. So we see Reform go from 2 seats that they hold at the moment in those areas, that's Lee Anderson and Richard Tice, to 81 seats.
Wow.
And 59 of those gains come from Labour constituencies, and they tend to be the kind of what we now think of as red wall constituencies which were historically Labour, went back to the Tories under Boris Johnson, then went to Labour in last year's general election, and now are looking at Reform. So we're really seeing the kind of end stage consequence of Boris Johnson breaking open the red wall and breaking that link between these communities and Labour.
The one that really brings this home, Camilla, is Ed Milliband's seat. So that's Doncaster North. He would lose that seat on this analysis of how people voted in the local council elections in his constituency by 46% to 29%. We always know, don't we, with these type of, if a local election happened as a national election, you could never kind of make that direct comparison. But given the huge gap between 46 and 29, this does show that not only are the Conservatives facing an existential moment, so could Labour.
It's exactly right. I think Doncaster is the perfect example that illustrates this. I mean, if you look at Doncaster Council, Labour has been the largest party on that council pretty much forever, since the council was created in 1974, I think. There was a brief period where they had no overall control, but they were still the largest party. The election results that we saw at the beginning of this month show that Reform now has something like twice the number of councillors that Labour has. And Ed Milliband is seriously in trouble here. And
even the Common Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle in Chorley, not, you would say. It's such a Labour heartland. And you think to yourself, my goodness me, Reform could get in there. Do you know what? Again, last night, sorry to name drop, I was having a chat with Aaron Banks, who is the kind of one of the bad boys of Brexit, very close to Nigel Farage. And that extraordinary result for him going for the mayoralty in Bristol and coming second. And I was like, explain this to me. I associate Bristol with being pretty woke. Let's toss a statue of Colston in the river and let's, all be studenty and believe in net zero and all the rest of it. And he was just saying, look, this conventional idea about left and right is out of the window now. What we saw was a demonstration of sort of pro-woke and anti-woke voting. And I kind of thought, gosh, if you apply that to the whole of the country, I mean, I appreciate it's early days, isn't it? It could be that Reform have peaked too soon, Tony, maybe. I don't know. Or do you think they're going to continue to grow and grow?
Well, I think it comes back to what I was talking about making them this serious, credible force. I mean, they've certainly got the votes. And people on the other side and people in Labour I spoke to about this research before we published it say, oh, well, people don't vote the same way in general elections as they do in locals. Oh, it's a protest vote. We're only 1 year into the term, so we've got 4 years to make it up. Well, that may well be true, but the numbers speak for themselves. Reform is way ahead in the polls, and they've got a serious opportunity here to hang on to those votes. And it looks like we've got more by-elections coming up. We've got some more news yesterday about Tory MPs misbehaving. That may well result in a by-election.
Yeah.
That could be another seat that Reform could take. If we carry on the rate of attrition of MPs that we are at the moment, Reform could well be sitting with 10, 11 MPs by the end of this Parliament, at which point they've got national spokespeople on a range of issues. They've got a front bench that they can talk of properly.
They finally got a female MP, which helps. I did say to Sarah Pochin, fair enough, you have alleviated the so-called woman problem. She's very presentable, very nice lady, former Conservative, she's an asset.
She's got quite a broad hinterland as well,
yes,
politically. Another thing, for every councillor that they now have, that's a new set of activists. It means their ground campaign becomes much, much stronger each time they fight a set of elections. We tend to slightly forget that in the last set of these same council elections in 2021, they won 2 seats. To go from that to 600 and some, whatever it is now, that now gives them this new network of campaigning people on the ground. Before we came on air, Camilla, we were sharing a piece alongside your piece, Tony, for the Telegraph today on this poll. Is a piece from a former Doncaster Labour councillor that we were saying, Camilla, is firing 3 barrels at Keir Starmer. And the problem for Keir Starmer is not only he has to protect himself against the reform momentum, which he's tried to do with immigration, all the things we've heard from him, believe it or not, he's also got a problem from the left, because this Doncaster councillor is saying Labour are no longer Labour. What he was hearing on the doorsteps was the winter fuel cut, the benefits cuts. We didn't come into government to be another austerity-led party. So Starmer is starting to get a problem that he's getting attacked, and he's losing on both flanks. And if you look at Sadiq Khan, making quite negative noises about Starmer on immigration, which has obviously been criticised for echoing Enoch Powell. You've got the leader of the Welsh Labour Party, where we've got Welsh elections next year, distancing herself from Keir Starmer, saying that we need to be more sort of left-wing and traditional Labour. It shows the real problem for the government in navigating between these two forces.
Also, unemployment being up this week, and that's what Kemi Badenoch went for when she did PMQs earlier. I mean, that is going to resonate with the working people that Labour relies on to win elections.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, it is worth saying that there is a Downing Street counter-argument and a Labour Party HQ counter-argument to all of this, which is to say, well, we won the general election with this huge majority on basically a centrist platform, campaigning for change against the Tories, but not trying to do anything too controversial and anything too left-wing. And that's where all of our votes came from. And so now there are a lot of left-wing people who are coming out of the woodwork and saying, oh, well, now we're in power. Perhaps, my hobby horse that I've had sat on the shelf for the last 14 years when the Tories were in government, we can bring that out and we can do all this left-wing stuff. We have an opportunity. The Downing Street counter-argument is to say, well, people don't want that stuff. That's why they didn't vote for Jeremy Corbyn. What they want is a basically centrist government that is trying to occupy as much space on the political spectrum as it possibly can, with this kind of left-wing rising fortunes of the Green Party and then Reform to the right. That's the counter-argument. Now, well, of course, as we saw in the elections, their current approach is not especially popular. The question is whether or not they will be able to sell it again as we head towards the next general election. But I think there is a bit of a red herring in saying, oh, well, maybe Keir Starmer's just not that left-wing enough. Actually, voters don't really like parties that are very left-wing, and we have actually seen that over the last 10 years.
But it's got I think that's absolutely right. I don't think you'd ever win an election from the left. I think that is a bogus argument, and the public vote against it time and time again. The problem he has, though, is that he has to keep party discipline. and he has to keep his MPs voting for him, and to have this much noise 10 months into a new government. I think just like in public, it's a shallow win for Starmer. In his party, it's a shallow win for Starmer. And managing the party is one of the most tiring things a Labour leader has to do. Look at Tony Blair. Despite being the most successful Labour Prime Minister in history, his party didn't like him. And in the end, it did for him. And they got in Gordon Brown, and he lost.
Yeah.
And I can see a similar... Labour, there's an odd thing in Labour. Labour doesn't really like winning because it means compromise and it means listening to the public. And Labour are not very good at either of those things.
Also, Blair was a much more convincing centrist stroke sort of blue Labourite.
Yeah, because he believed it. Yeah.
As we've witnessed this week, you know, Starmer's almost damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. If he pivots to the left, then he's hated by the right of his party. If he maintains that he's a righty when everyone knows he's a lefty, he seems completely disingenuous. I mean, Alison Pearson summed it up, you know, the whole immigration and channeling of Farage was as convincing as the orgasm scene Meg Ryan performed in When Harry Met Sally. So anyway, Tony, you have to run. Thank you for your analysis on the Daily Tea today.
Thanks for having me.
So really good polling today for Nigel Farage. But Camilla, what's your final take on this day? Because as we said at the top of the podcast, it is a day where you see these two sides of Nigel Farage. The man who could blow up the UK political consensus, be the next Prime Minister. But is he actually fit to run a big team where he cannot get everything his way?
It's hard to know, isn't it? I mean, I know the guy personally. He is single-minded. He's polite. He treats staff well. You know, I share a producer with him at GB News. He's under enormous pressure now. This is the other thing. You know, he came out of the wilderness, out of the jungle, back into the political fray. It's now getting serious, isn't it? You know, go and find 650 people to compete for seats across the country. Your leadership's going to be put to the test. You're going to have to remove knives from your back. I think the jury's still out. Let's just see how he gets on. But I will say this, you know, this cut-through issue, yes, we're obsessing over the Rupert Lowe row. Is anyone out in the shires? Is anyone in the Red Wall sort of thinking about this much? Or does his popularity on social media, the TV and beyond, just transcend all this stuff?
I think there are small tremors. I think you're right. I think there are small tremors, nothing threatening as yet. But if Farage is smart, he will notice these tremors about his character, and can he build this big, smart, top team? The smartest prime ministers, and if we do think Margaret Thatcher, and I obviously think, you know, Tony Blair, they surrounded themselves with big people who knew their work as a politician, and Nigel Farage has got to be brave enough to do that in Reform. And if you look at, you know, how he is trying to build this internal policy unit, he actually wants to kind of make announcements of substance. Can he turn from a disruptor into a significant political leader?
Final thought, by the way. So my son is coming in for work experience here next week.
We're looking forward to it.
Looking forward to that. And I've arranged for him to accompany me to a lunch that I think a number of key politicians are going to be at next week. I'm not going to mention it for security purposes. First question to me, is Nigel Farage going to be there? I said, I'm not sure. I think Boris Johnson might be there. Oh, no. I'm only interested in seeing Nigel Farage. I'm just saying that from a Gen Z sort of young person's perspective, that regardless of any of this shenanigans that's been going on, he remains the star player as far as quite a lot of young people concerned.